This is 696 Exchange Street, deep in the heart of the Larkinville district of the city of Buffalo. Today, it's a little more than a parking lot, but 70 years ago, it was known as Box 1141 by the Buffalo Fire Department, a 10-story, 200,000 square foot factory that had once been part of the massive 21-building industrial complex owned, built, and operated by the Larkin Sub Company. On March 8th, 1954, this building, then owned by the Bison Waste and Wiper Company, was involved in one of the largest fires in department history in its last general alarm. A fire simply known as the Larkin Fire. To give you an idea of the scale of this fire, the on-scene manpower alone totaled 400 paid personnel and another 100 volunteers from the Civil Defense Force, operating over 50 combined pieces of apparatus between the two services. 500 firefighters, roughly what the French threw at Notre Dame. And this is before we even get to the scores of off-duty paid personnel and the members of the various volunteer fire companies that went into the city, backfilling the stations to cover the rest of the city while the fire was still raging. In comparison, the 1983 North Division propane explosion that killed 5 firefighters, injured 30 more, origami folded 3 20-plus ton fire apparatus, turned 4 city blocks into a parking lot, and busted every window south of the I-190, only rated a 5th alarm and 125 firefighters from 25 pieces of apparatus. And yet this fire is almost completely forgotten about today, having been paved over just like the building was in 1962. Even in the Buffalo Fire Department, the story of this fire is little more than an oral history at this point, told by retirees and department historians who themselves have only ever heard it secondhand from the individuals who were there. In fact, without the help of the Buffalo Fire Historical Society, I wouldn't even have enough material for a single video on this fire, never mind a whole 3-part series. Everything I have, incident reports, newspaper clippings, photos, and even the dispatch tapes from the fire, all came from them. I also want to thank Mike Casella, a good friend of mine at the Buffalo Harbor Museum, who provided me with a treasure trove of information on the Larkin Sub Company for helping me tell this story. This is a story that doesn't begin in 1954, but instead 1875. That was when John D. Larkin sold his share of the soap company he had been helping his brother-in-law run in Chicago and returned to Buffalo to start his own. Larkin, a Buffalo native and son of a volunteer firefighter who had died in the line of duty when he was 7, quickly set up shop at a 3,000 square foot, 2-story factory at 196 Chicago Street. It wasn't long before he needed more space, and he built a new factory at the corner of Seneca and Heacock Street in 1877 in an area known at the time as the Hydraulics. He chose the spot for 2 reasons: the numerous creeks that ran through the neighborhood and gave it its name, and the proximity to the slaughterhouses that provided him with all the animal fat he needed to produce his soaps. A year later, in 1878, Larkin would bring in his wife's brother, Albert Hubbard, into the company as a traveling salesman. As the 1870s gave way to the 1880s, Hubbard conceived of an idea that would define the company for nearly 50 years. Rather than selling through general stores, Hubbard suggested selling directly to the households, and more specifically the housewives that ran them. To incentivize these mail orders, Hubbard packaged them with premiums, small gifts such as dish towels and bath towels for the soaps, as well as toys for the kids. These $6 and $10 combination boxes were soon selling like hotcakes, and while Hubbard left the company during the Panic of 1893 following a disagreement with Larkin, the Larkin idea he created would continue well past the company's liquidation in the 1940s. Larkin wasn't the only man looking to make his wealth along the shores of Lake Erie either. As strange as it might seem today, Buffalo in the late 1800s was experiencing an economic boom that elevated to the same political and cultural level as New York City or Boston. If you were moving goods between the East Coast ports and the Western frontier, a good chance at some point you are going to be on the Great Lakes. And if you are on the Great Lakes, there's a good chance either your starting or ending point was going to be Buffalo. Grain silos, slaughterhouses, factories, you couldn't throw a rock in what's now downtown Buffalo or the old First Ward without breaking a window of one of them. Naturally, as the number of factories increased, so too did the number of fires. Remember, this is the 1800s. The fire and building codes are non-existent, and the easily knocked over oil lamps are plentiful. The number of fires quickly outpaced the city's dozen volunteer fire companies' ability to manage them. Things finally came to a head in the winter of 1879, when the push to form a municipal fire company finally succeeded after two failed attempts in 1861 and 1871. By April of 1880, all 12 fire companies had been dissolved and reformed into one municipal fire service. The 1880s continued to be a turbulent time in Buffalo despite the establishment of a new fire department and its fleet of horse-drawn steam engine pumpers to quell the blazes. Fires continued to be a nightly occurrence, and rarely were buildings saved. A particularly windy night on February 2nd, 1889, led to the largest fire in the city's history since the British had burned it down during the War of 1812. The Great Wells Street Fire of 1889 would ultimately destroy a 6-square-block area of Wells Street between Seneca and Exchange Street, causing $3 million in damage and claiming the life of firefighter Richard Marion. Despite being a little over a mile away from the blaze, Larkin's company managed to avoid the fate of those businesses on Wells Street. In fact, Larkin had a pretty good run when it came to workplace safety, at least as long as we're ignoring that explosion that occurred in the early 1890s that knocked off a 100-foot section of the top floor. Hey, given that at the time your average grain silo in the Outer Harbor was lucky to make it to its 10th birthday before a grain dust fire burnt it to the ground, I'll take what I can get safety-wise. While Larkin didn't need to rebuild during the 1890s, he did need to expand his operations. By 1900, the Larkin Company was selling 36 million pounds of product, and that number would nearly triple to 87 million pounds by 1906. The combination boxes were discontinued in 1900, not because they were no longer selling, but because the premiums no longer fit inside a 1-foot by 1-foot soapbox. Furniture, glassware, silverware, cooking utensils, pots and pans, fine china. If you wanted it, there's a good chance the Larkin Company could provide it to you, provided you bought $10 worth of soap first. Soon, Larkin clubs sprang up in communities all over the country. These groups of 6 to 12 individuals would collectively purchase $10 worth of Larkin products, with the premium month being awarded to one member drawn at random. These clubs, essentially the product parties your parents hosted without the Ponzi scheme, soon propelled Larkin as a nationwide name with a mail-order business second only to Sears in the size of its catalog. If that sounds like a little much for one 5,000 square foot factory to handle, then you and Larkin were on the same page. In the decade between 1895 and 1905, he would buy up the rest of the lots on Seneca Street and expand his factory bit by bit. The resulting complex appeared to onlookers as one gigantic 10-story brick monolith stretching from Larkin Street to Van Rensselaer. In fact, it was 12 separate factories, each carefully designed to maintain this illusion. Larkin insisted on building each of these factories with the latest turn-of-the-century fire prevention technology, as well as above-ground and below-ground passageways to allow workers to move between them without ever stepping foot in the cold Buffalo winters. The complex still exists today as 701 Seneca Street, though unfortunately the brick exterior has since been covered with white stucco. To power all this, Larkin had an on-site power plant built on the other side of the Larkin Street in 1902. On the map, that would be Building I. The two warehouses next to it, L and M, were built in 1904 as the factory continued to grow to meet demands. The power plant itself, housing 20 500-horsepower steam boilers, burned approximately 1 ton of coal a day to provide electrical power to the entire complex as well as steam for radiator heat in the winter. In 1903, Larkin's corporate secretary Darwin D. Martin brought in renowned architect Frank Lloyd Wright to construct the new administration building going up at the corner of Seneca and Swan. Wright undertook the project with all the creative gusto for which his designs were known for, at least when he wasn't working on Martin's private residence at 125 Jewett Parkway, or company vice president William Hearst's residence at 76 Soldiers Place. Frankly, Larkin should probably count his lucky stars that he didn't hire Walter V. Davidson as the company's advertising manager until after the building was completed, or the good chance it wouldn't have been finished until the 1920s. As for the administrative building itself, oh, what a building it was. There's a reason this 5-story tall red sandstone monolith is widely regarded as the pinnacle of American corporate architecture when it was completed in 1906. Wright managed to combine the latest architectural techniques with his embrace of natural lighting and his simplistic yet eye-catching ornamentation to create a building that was both warm and inviting for those that worked inside, while still serving as the defining symbol of the Larkin Company's power to those on the outside. And this power would continue to grow. As 1910 rolled around, Larkin found that he needed 3 more warehouses to accommodate both the increase in railcar traffic as well as delivery vehicles that were beginning to gain popularity over the horse-drawn buggies. Coincidentally, he happened to have an empty block free on Exchange Street between Van Rensselaer and Hydraulic Street. Thus was born the R, S, and T buildings, better known today as the Larkin Terminal Warehouse. For those of you who have been paying attention, you'll probably have noticed that I skipped one specific building nestled between the industrial complex and the terminal. This would be the star of our show, Building P. Built in 1908, Building P was a 10-story, 200-foot long by 100-foot wide daylight factory designed to utilize as much natural light as possible to illuminate the workspaces inside during business hours. Like all the Larkin buildings, it still supports and double-layer brick exterior wall were designed to retain their structural integrity in the event of a fire. Which is a good thing too, because Larkin wasted no time in trying to turn it into a giant tinderbox. Floors 1, 2, and 4 were unremarkable, serving as general storage. Starting at floor 3, though, things get interesting. The 3rd story served as a paint storage area, and you have to remember at this time, most paints are oil-based. Floor number 5 was only slightly better, filled to the brim with product catalogs and cardboard packaging. On top of all that was floors 6 through 9, all dedicated to furniture manufacturing of one form or another, and all dripping with paints, stains, and varnishes, along with mountains of wooden fabric. This might not seem like a big deal in 1908, but when you consider the fate of the Larkin Company decades from now, and the fact that the fumes from the chemicals in these buildings are well known to permeate wood, you can see why it might be a good idea to remember this list for part 2. That's a problem for the Buffalo Fire Department of 1954, though. The BFD of 1910 has a little bit more to worry about at the moment. Mainly the fact that they're in the process of replacing all their horse-drawn engines with motorized apparatus. These vehicles are coming from various manufacturers, many of which are still recognizable today, such as Pierce Arrow, Seagrave, and Aaron's Fox. Down the road in Elmira, New York, a little company known as American LaFrance would build its first fire engine in 1907. The march of progress didn't come without casualties, though, as the 6 chemical companies throughout the state were retired from service by 1920 in favor of more conventional fire engines. The Buffalo waterfront had grown into the single largest grain port in the world by the turn of the century. While the switch from wooden elevators to concrete slowly began to eliminate their tendency to burn to the ground at the slightest spark, it also replaced it with a tendency to launch themselves into orbit at the slightest spark. Oil was beginning to make inroads into the waterfront too, bringing with it oil tankers that would spontaneously combust at the slightest provocation. To take some of the pressure off the aging John T. Hutchinson and George R. Potter, the 118-foot-long William S. Grattan was commissioned in 1900. The Grattan can still be seen roaming the harbor 125 years later, now called the Edward M. Cotter. By the time Buffalo had entered the Roaring Twenties, the BFD had grown to over 40 pieces of apparatus. Even as Buffalo continued to grow, the fortune of the Larkin Company would already start to wane. 1920 would be the high point of the company's history, with almost $23 million worth of sales. 10 years later, sales would barely be able to break $13 million. The cause for this decline was the 1-2 punch of the mass adoption of personal automobiles and the emergence of national chain retail stores. The post-World War I generation, especially young women, wanted the freedom to go into town and buy what they needed, not wait a month for it to be delivered at their door. Larkin's son, John D. Larkin Jr., attempted to diversify the company by opening grocery stores and gas stations while reducing the focus on the mail order side of the business. These ventures proved to be barely profitable enough to sustain themselves, and Jr. only succeeded in chasing out far more experienced executives such as Darwin Martin, who retired in 1925 in frustration over the company's direction. John D. Larkin would die in 1926 at the age of 80, leaving his company rudderless just when it needed a firm hand to steer the ship the most. The Great Depression proved to be the final nail in the Larkin Company's coffin, wiping out both the mail order side of the business and Junior's attempts to diversify all in one fell swoop. The company would continue plodding along, stopping the manufacturing of soap in 1939, and all manufacturing altogether in 1941. The company was reorganized as Larkin Company Incorporated in 1945, now occupying only a single floor of the terminal warehouse, as it continued to operate a more modest mail-order business from its remaining stockpiles until closing for good in 1962. The sprawling 2.1 million square foot Larkin complex was quietly sold off in 1943 to various businesses and development groups seeking to expand in mid-World War II. The administrative building, once the pinnacle of Buffalo architecture, was now viewed as a white elephant. It sat vacant for 7 years as numerous real estate deals and other ideas were proposed, only to subsequently fall through before the city finally decided to tear it down in 1950. The building was demolished brick by brick, much to the frustration of generations of architecture students everywhere. Building P was purchased by the Bison Waste and Wiper Company in 1950. The company planned on occupying the first 3 floors for its rags and diaper manufacturing business while renting out the remaining floors. However, it was still in the process of renovating in March of 1954. Even as the Larkin Company collapsed, Buffalo continued to grow around it. The mass industrial mobilization of World War II created a second economic boom that pulled the city out of the Great Depression and returned it to economic heights that surpassed the early 1900s. Even with the threat of the Welland Canal on the horizon, the city's future still seemed bright. As the city expanded, the fire department raced to keep up. Budgets had been tight during the Great Depression, especially after the Grattan, the only remaining fireboat at this point, found herself parked between 2 exploding oil tankers in 1928 and needed a complete keel-up rebuild to repair the damage. The situation didn't improve much during the war, as all the major manufacturers had their factories repurposed to produce tanks, planes, and trucks for the war effort. It wasn't until the late 40s that Buffalo was able to modernize their fleet. By 1954, most of the department was using either Ward or American LaFrance fire engines, with a few Buffalo Fire appliance pumpers purchased in the early 1930s still serving out their final years of service. By 1954, the Buffalo Fire Department had nearly 1,500 personnel divided across 33 engine companies, 15 truck companies, 2 high-pressure hose companies, and the fireboat Edward M. Cotter. This map from 1955, though not quite accurate to the battalion boundaries at the time of the fire, still gives us a pretty good idea on where everyone was. Up north along the Black Rock Canal and Niagara Rivers, you had Engine 26 at their little castle at 693 Tonawanda Street, Engine 15 at 64 Amherst Street, Engine 19 at 209 Forest Ave, and Engines 11, Ladder 4, and Battalion Chief B44 at 1197 Niagara Street. Going a little west of Engine 15 gets you to Ladder 12 at 395 Amherst, and a little further after that gets you Engine 36 at 1655 Elmwood Ave. Following Delaware Park, you would have had Engine 38, Ladder 13, and B47 at 627 Colvin Ave, Engine 34 at 2829 Main Street, and Engine 24 and Ladder 7 at 110 Leroy Ave. Engine 23 at 2930 Bailey Avenue, Engine 31 and Ladder 14 at 2025 Bailey Avenue, and Engine 22 at 1522 Broadway, and Engine 28 at 1170 East Lovejoy Street made up the eastern boundary of the city. Moving south from Delaware Park, you have Engine 37 at 166 Cleveland Ave, Engine 16 at 1416 Main Street, and Engine 21 and Ladder 6 at 421 Best Street. For those wondering why I didn't mention Rescue 1, hold that thought for about 24 years. Rounding out Battalion 5 was Engine 33 and B45 out of 275 Kerr Street. Down in South Buffalo, you had Engine 30 out on an island at 2028 South Park Avenue. A little further north, you have Ladder 10 at 131 Southside Parkway. And a little further north from that, you have Engine 25 and B48 at 517 Southside Parkway. On the other side of the 190, Engine 35 and Ladder 15 at 1512 Clinton Street. Now, so far, had the Larkin fire been your run-of-the-mill commercial fire, none of these companies would have mattered to the story. Even adding Engine 2 and Ladder 9 at 310 Jersey Street, Engine 13 in the high-pressure company at 175 Court Street, Ladder 4 Engine 9 and B-42 at 707 Washington Street, Engine 4 at 138 Spruce Street, Engine 18 and 1032 Fillmore Ave, and Ladder 11 and B-43 at 363 Fillmore Ave only fills out our third and fourth alarm units, who are only getting called if things are really going bad. That's not going to be the case from now on, as we reach the units in downtown Buffalo, the Old First Ward, and Larkinville itself. So pay attention, because these will be on the test the next time we meet. For your second alarm units, we have Engine 1 and Ladder 2 at 132 Ellicott Street, Engine 8 and Ladder 8 at 174 Chicago Street, Engine 12 at 414 Chicago Street, and Engine 27 at 31 Johnson Street. For those wondering why I haven't mentioned either the Engine 20 or Engine 10, well, Engine 20 is the Cotter, fresh off a year-long rebuild to replace raging boilers and simply name the firefighter at this point. I'm still working on exactly why Engine 10 at 30 Granson Street has been left off the dance card, though. Finally, we have our first alarm companies. B41, stationed with Engine 1 and Ladder 2, and B46 out on Smith Street would be your commanding officers. Engine 3 and Ladder 3 are spawning out of 312 Spring Street, and Engine 5 at 235 Emsley would be supporting them. First on scene, though, would be Engine 32 and Ladder 5, stationed a little over a football field away at the corner of Seneca and Swan. And there you have it, 49 pieces of apparatus with 400 firefighters riding them. By the time the clock struck 3:30 p.m. on March 8, 1954, a little under 2 hours into the call, every single one of them would be at 696 Exchange Street, fighting the monster that occupied this 10-story building.